Hi, I'm Lisha. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist at UCL.
Why did you want to be a clinical psychologist?
So I didn't actually want to be a clinical psychologist. When I was younger, my parents were very much laying down a path for me to go into medicine or engineering because that's the Indian thing to do. So I started working as a healthcare assistant on a ward with people who'd had a stroke. And I met a clinical psychologist there, and I think I was just really surprised, very pleasantly surprised at how she understood people and what she was going through. I know now that what she was doing was called formulation. And I just really liked her way of thinking, and she slowly introduced me into the world of psychology. And it just made me think, I like seeing people as a whole. And it also made me think about, in India, there's not actually that much infrastructure for mental health. And I think I was just really taken by the idea of maybe if I go into this and if I do some clinical psychology training, maybe it's something that I could take back home and put in place for the people there. So yeah, I applied and now I'm here.
Top tips on getting relevant work experience.
My first top tip would be try and start early if you can. So for me, for instance, I started working as a support worker whilst I was doing my undergrad, and I'd also worked a little bit as a healthcare assistant. And I think that really helped me get a clinical job when I'd finished my degree. It's not always easy to get paid work though, so if you can, and you don't always have the capacity to work whilst you're studying, so an alternative would be to do some volunteering. So one of the organizations that I volunteered for was Victim Support, which is just offering telephone counseling to people who had been victims of crime. Doing little things like that a little bit early on. It's a nice addition to your CV and might help you get a job a little bit quicker. The second top tip would be, don't get fixated on the idea of becoming an assistant psychologist. It's great if you have an assistant post, but we all know it's incredibly competitive. You know, being a support worker, going into graduate mental health work, all of that stuff is equally useful. You will get very relevant experience that will help you with your application. So just bear that in mind, there are other options. A lot of the people on the course are also PWPs, so that's another alternative. Next thing would be ask and you shall receive. So if you're working somewhere as a healthcare assistant, a graduate mental health worker, you're volunteering, whatever you're doing, if there's a psychologist or someone like that who can introduce you to or bring you into the world of clinical psychology a little bit, don't be afraid to ask them if you can help out in some way. If you happen to go to some conferences and there's someone there who you think can be a useful contact, just go up to them, and you never know what comes out of it. Yeah, I think those would be my top tips.
Do's and don'ts for the DClinPsy application.
My first would be, do apply. I think it's great that there are all these conversations happening about widening access and getting more people, more diversity into the training. I think it's a great conversation to have. I sometimes wonder if a slight drawback might be that people think there's no point applying because they're less likely to get on. Which is why my first would be, do apply, you can get on. It's not easy, but you can get on. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing would be to have a conversation with trainees. So for example, if you're thinking about applying to 4 universities and you know the 4 universities, I think it's helpful to have a conversation, if you can, with some of the trainees to get a sense of how they're experiencing the course, what the support structure is like. And I think it can just help you make a slightly more informed decision about whether or not it's a place that you want to go to. Then it would be to think about your experiences, think about your clinical experiences, and try and map it onto some of the competencies that you know is expected from a clinical psychologist. So for example, if you're working as a support worker, you want to start thinking about, well, what is the range of clients that I'm working with, the setting that you're working in, the type of work that you're doing. that sort of thing. So some of the key competencies might be that, working with a range of people in a range of services, using different models, also assessment, formulation, intervention, evaluation, that sort of thing. You want to keep that in your mind. So when you're actually working your way through your application, you want to try and hit some of those areas if possible. When you're writing your application, I think it's helpful to think about, so some people do this thing where they try and pack in all of their experiences, which is great because we know that, when you get to the point of application, you probably have a lot that you're trying to show off or convey. But the thing is, there's not that much space. So you want to try and focus in on the one or two experiences that's really going to make you stand out and develop those stories where you can, and try and demonstrate an understanding of the role of clinical psychology. So we aren't just clinicians, we're also leaders, we're scientist practitioners, we're consultants. And what that means is that when you're working in a place like the NHS, where resources are quite tight, you might be pulled in different directions. You just want to take maybe a couple of sentences to show that you understand what you're actually applying for. And finally, I would say, once you've decided on your universities, you've written your application, you feel somewhat satisfied with it, do share it with someone, just so you can get a sense of how it reads. They can sort of let you know what your strong points are, but they can also tell you where you need to do a little bit of development and maybe the stuff that's missing a little bit as well. So those would be my main do's for application. Okay, my don'ts for applications would be, I didn't find it very helpful to go onto different forums, like the Clinical Psychology Forum. Sometimes it felt a little bit unhelpful because I started comparing my experiences with the experiences of others, and I started to have thoughts like, oh my gosh, they're so much better than me. And it was just a little bit stressful, and it did make me avoid the applications. So my advice would be, maybe don't do that. The second would be, don't give up. Even if you've applied once before or twice before and you haven't gotten on, if it's something that you're really passionate about, I would say go for it. Keep trying, set yourself a limit, and then keep trying. And don't forget that there are other opportunities out there. You can go into, there's so many other jobs out there. This is not the be all and end all. So just try and hold that in mind. And then last couple of things would be about the application. Maybe one thing I've noticed people do when they're actually writing the application is they sort of spend these precious characters saying things like they have excellent organizational skills or excellent verbal communication skills, which is all great, but maybe you want to let your experience speak for itself. So I would say if you're trying to cut back on words, maybe look at your application and think, what is the likelihood of someone else having some of this exact same stuff, the excellent organization skills, the excellent communication skills, and just drop it. And then it'll just give you a little bit more space to, build on some of the more meaningful stuff that's actually setting you apart from the crowd a little bit. And lastly, don't forget to look after yourself. The whole thing is really stressful. There's something about the narrative that really makes it quite emotional. So just remember to take time to look after yourself, spend time with friends and doing things that you love, which is not psychology related.
Do's and don'ts for the DClinPsy interview.
So my main do's for the interviews, what I found helpful, and you might hear this from other people as well. First of all, do brush up on some basic theories that you can weave into your answers. So I'm talking attachment, the Erikson's psychosocial developmental stuff, social identity theory, relationship to help, some of those key ones, because those are the ones you can name drop those theories into your answers, and it just immediately you've got your theory practice links right there. So that's something useful to think about. My second tip would be to do role play, do talk. It might sound ridiculous, but do practice looking at the mirror. I highly recommend doing a role play with another person, because what that gives you is just a sense of how you cope when you're feeling a little bit stressed out, when you're feeling a little bit watched, and you might also suddenly notice that the answers you have in your head isn't coming out the way you expected it to, and it just gives you that space to just refine your technique a little bit. I highly recommend that. My other do, would be to stop prepping the night before, maybe actually stop prepping the afternoon before. So stop all interview prep the day before. By lunchtime, you're done. If you don't know it by then, it doesn't matter. And you just want to take the evening, do something nice, watch a comedy, do some yoga, go to church, whatever makes you feel good, and just chill out, get a good night's sleep, wake up the next day and just give it the best that you can. And that's all you can do. And actually on the same note, what really helped for me was to have like a mantra. So what I found for me, my mantra was, you've got this. And I just kept telling myself throughout the application process, in my head, of course, it's like a self-affirmation thing where I was like, you've got this, Lisha. So by the time I got to the interview, I'd actually convinced myself that I'd got this. So, when I walked into the interview, I was full of swagger and I was ready for this. So I would say it's really, have a mantra, just a self-affirmation to boost your skills. Lastly, I do think it's helpful to just have an awareness of the courses that you're applying to, because it'll just broaden your thinking a little bit. So for instance, at UCL, everybody knows it's quite biopsychosocial, and the whole developmental psychopathology seems to be their main thing. At UEL, they have their social constructionist approach. And it's good to have this, not because you want to try and fit your answers to what they want, but more because if you think about from these different perspectives, you're just increasing the flexibility of your thought processes. You're allowing for multiple perspectives, and that's never a bad thing. So those would be my top do's for interviews. Okay, my don'ts for interviews would be, don't try and give the answer you think the person on the other side of the table wants to hear. I think one, you'll be selling yourself short. You might not come across as very authentic. And you might be assuming what they want to hear. So I think that your safest bet would actually just give your honest thoughts about what the question is. So that's the biggest don't. The second would be, don't be afraid to pause and take a minute to think in the interviews. You've probably heard this quite a lot, but I do think it's really key. Because my experience is that some of the interviews are really designed to ask questions that are not expected. And the reason they're doing that is they just want to see how you think on the spot. So taking a minute to pause and to really process that question, it's not a bad thing. It's just going to look like you're applying some thought to it. So don't be afraid to do that. And I know I said I'd finish with my do's, but here's my last do. It would be, do practice just thinking of things from different perspectives. Get people to ask you unexpected questions. So one of the questions that came up at UCL last year, which was quite unexpected, was why does racism still exist, or something along those lines. And it was not a question that I expected to come up. So it's just something for you to bear in mind. Just ask yourself these questions and just have a go of thinking on the spot and see what comes up for you. And that might be really helpful across the board.
What obstacles have you experienced on your journey to being a clinical psychologist?
It hasn't been easy, for sure. I think I was actually thinking about how to answer this question. It's quite tricky. It's not been easy for me. So the first thing that I found a little bit difficult, perhaps because psychology wasn't really in my repertoire before that particular psychologist I met as a healthcare assistant, I hadn't really anticipated how difficult this journey would be. So with that context, I think one of the things that I found initially quite hard was just getting relevant experience was quite tricky. So, this precious assistant psych post was really hard. So I think I fired off so many applications, and I think I would maybe get one interview. I think that was a bit of a wake-up call, but I think what I learned from that was just that being resilient is really important if you're going to make this journey. So that was one of my first obstacles, but I jumped over that, which is fine. Worked my way through it rather. The other obstacle, which was even less expected, was some of my, I guess you would call it microaggressions that I'd experienced from some of my early supervisors. So it was just things like, no matter what I did, I couldn't quite do it right. No matter what I said, it was just never the right thing to say. And when you just get that feeling where you're just like, I don't know what's not working here, but something's not working. And that was in my first assistant post, and I found that incredibly hard. because I was one of the very few women of color there. And so one of the things that just kept coming into the back of my head is, could this be something to do with my race? And it was an uncomfortable thought for me to sit with, because sometimes it feels like there's nothing you can do about it, and it was a consultant psychologist. So that was a little bit hard, and it almost made me think about giving up psychology, because I was like, if this is what they're like, then I don't want to do it. But I spoke with some of the people that I really care about and who really gave me the space to listen to it. And what they said is, Lisha, no matter what job you go into, you're going to have these experiences and you can't just give up. So that was one of the other obstacles I had. And the final couple too, as maybe things that a lot of people are experiencing now. So one was how people talk about assistant psychologists. I found that a little bit difficult. When they say things like unqualified and things like that, it sort of makes you sometimes feel a little bit devalued. It wasn't so much an obstacle, but it was something that bothered me a little bit. And the other thing was my expectations of what being an assistant would be, which I was expecting a lot more clinical work, whereas actually the reality is you're doing a lot of data-driven work. So those are less obstacles and more some expectation management, I suppose. And I guess one thing I would say to you is, if that's something that you're coming across, if you're coming across some of these things, I would say be resilient, persevere, and with the expectations of being an assistant, just, if you're doing a lot of data-driven work, remember that you can frame it in your application as leadership skills. And actually every experience that you have along the way is going to build your character. Remember why they were upsetting for you and take that forward. So when you are qualified and in a position of power, you can remember how not to be.
How has your experience of training been?
So far, it's been good, I think. So we recently had a reflective practice here at UCL, so with the trainees, and we were all asked to bring along an object of some description that represented our journey in our training so far. And what I bought was a smooth black rock, is what I took to reflective practice, because I felt like it actually really nicely captured what it's been like for me. And the reason I bought the black rock is because overall training has been quite smooth, in that there's been no significant setbacks, but it has felt quite heavy at times, because one of the things about training is a lot of the stuff they're teaching you, something will connect with some of your own personal experiences, and it will trigger, some thinking on your part, some reflections of how your life has been. So at times it's been a little bit heavy, at times it's been a little bit dark, just trying to lift yourself out of these reflections. So yeah, it's definitely a character building journey. I don't know if that sounds really cliche, but that's how I've experienced it.
How has being from a BAME background impacted your training experience?
Okay, so I'm still figuring it out, because we're still new to psychology and I don't actually have a fully formed answer for this yet. One thing I've noticed is the walls, so UCL has a wall with all the pictures of past cohorts, and over the years it has gotten more colourful, which is nice. So there's a little bit more diversity coming into it. But if I was to try and answer this question, there's two parts. One is how my background has affected placement, and the other is how the course handles BAME issues. So with placement, I've actually found that my background and my experiences has been quite valued by supervisors. So most of the supervisors I've only had two because I'm a second year, but they're both from white British backgrounds. And one thing, they really value what I have to bring. So they, when we're working with people, especially from Asian communities, they do ask me, what I know about the culture, and it has sort of fed into our formulation. And definitely when I'm working with people, I think I feel less reluctant to ask them certain questions that other people might not feel comfortable asking. I think also I'm an immigrant as well, so I think I definitely use my Asianism and my immigrant status to just be like, if I'm working with a white British person and if they're saying something, a pattern, an unhelpful pattern that I can't quite make sense of, I think it gives me something about my status allows me to say, I don't quite understand why you guys do that. And then it just helps me open up a new conversation, I suppose. In that sense, in placements, my background has been really useful and has been valued. On the course, I don't yet know. One thing I've noticed is that the course content isn't always massively inclusive. So there is a bigger focus on Western models of thinking. So, even when we're talking about families, it's very much talking about the Western idea of a family, so the nuclear family. So I think there's a little bit more work to be done on that front. But I think what's great about our cohort is that there's enough of us to start asking these questions. So we ourselves, we've set up it used to be called a Minorities Reflective Practice Group. Now we call it the Graces Reflective Practice for John Burnham's Graces acronym. So in that sense, we're trying to introduce a little bit more of that flavor to the course, and a few of us are on rep committees as well, and we take these issues there. So I think I am definitely feeling empowered, and I feel like actually I can do something to change this course. I can do something to introduce a little bit of difference here. So yeah, I think that's how it's playing out.
What advice would you give to your 16-year-old self?
To my 16-year-old self, I would say my biggest advice, if I could go back in time, it would be whatever happens, you'll be okay. Whatever happens, you'll be fine. Because I think sometimes you just get a little bit wrapped up in your own head around that time. There's so much pressure to decide what to do with your life, to do well in your GCSEs, to do well in your A-levels. And actually, you know what? I came to this country when I was 15. So predictably, I did terribly in my GCSEs. I did not do well. And I'm still okay. It's okay. I'm here. So I think just remember that you've got a lot of years ahead of you. If you haven't done so well in your exams, it's not the end of everything. And you have lots more opportunities ahead of you. So whatever happens, you'll be okay.
What advice would you give to your aspiring clinical psychologist self?
To my aspiring clinical psychologist self, I would say don't give up, persevere, and be resilient. You can do this. No one is a natural born psychologist. You can learn these skills. If anyone's making you feel like you're not good enough, write that off. In one ear, out the other, as my mom used to say. And yeah, that's it. Just don't give up and just stay strong and keep going, and you can do this. It's really important that there's more people of color in this profession because it really could do with the diversity. It really could do with the difference of thinking. So please keep going.